Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into the world of cyber espionage, specifically how the Russian government uses mobile devices to spy on their targets. We've got some fascinating case studies here, pulled from reports by cybersecurity firms, government agencies, and independent researchers. So get ready to uncover some seriously interesting tactics.
Yeah, it's a landscape that's constantly evolving, and what's particularly intriguing is how these tactics are being used in real-world situations, shaping events from the war in Ukraine to the targeting of political dissidents.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics, let's set the stage. Who are the main players behind these operations? I've heard names like Fancy Bear, Cozy Bear, even Sandworm. They sound like something out of a spy novel.
Right. They do have a certain mystique to them, but these groups are very real and very active. They often have ties to Russian intelligence agencies, Fancy Bear with the GRU, Cozy Bear with the SVR, and so on. What's concerning is their increasing focus on everyday Android and iPhone users. We're not just talking about government officials or high-profile targets anymore.
So journalists, activists, even ordinary citizens could be targets. That's a bit unsettling. What makes these groups so effective? Are we talking about incredibly complex hacking techniques?
Well, while the techniques are definitely sophisticated, often involving custom-made malware or exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities, what's equally important is the level of resources and expertise they have. This type of spyware is expensive to develop and deploy, showing a clear commitment from the Kremlin to offensive cyber operations.
I see. So it's not just a few rogue hackers tinkering away. This is a strategic investment for them.
Exactly. They are willing to dedicate significant time, money, and manpower to these campaigns. Let's start by delving into some specific examples, starting with Android malware campaigns.
All right, Android first. What kind of malware are we talking about here? What's a particularly striking example from our research?
One that stands out is Fancy Bear's X Agent, deployed back in 2016. They disguised this spyware as a legitimate app for Ukrainian artillery units designed to help soldiers calculate firing coordinates faster.
So they're creating malware that's specifically tailored to their target audience. That seems very calculated.
It is. It demonstrates a deep understanding of their target's needs and routines. Had this malware been successful, it could have provided the Russian military with real-time intelligence on Ukrainian troop movements and positions, potentially giving them a significant advantage on the battlefield.
That's a worrying thought. Are there other examples of this kind of targeted malware on Android?
Definitely. There's Monocle, another spyware developed by a Russian contractor linked to election interference. This one's particularly interesting because it managed to steal data even without having root access to the device.
So even without full control of the phone, they could still extract sensitive information. How did they manage that?
They exploited accessibility services, a feature designed to help users with disabilities to gather information from other apps installed on the phone. They also employed man-in-the-middle attacks, intercepting communication between the phone and the internet.
That's pretty sneaky. Have they ever tried to get their malware into the official Google Play Store?
Actually, yes. In 2019, Google discovered that Sandworm, another GRU-linked group, had managed to upload malware-laced apps to the Play Store. This shows they're not afraid to go after trusted platforms.
That's concerning. But if Google caught them, does that mean they were able to contain the threat?
Luckily, these attacks were relatively small-scale and targeted, suggesting a focus on specific individuals rather than mass infection. Google also has its own built-in security system, Google Play Protect, which has intervened in other cases. For example, Sandworm attempted to compromise a Ukrainian developer's account to insert backdoors into legitimate apps, but Google detected and blocked it.
That's reassuring. But I imagine these groups are always finding new ways to bypass security measures. Are there any recent examples of Android malware we should be aware of?
There's infamous Chisel, discovered in 2023, targeting Ukrainian military personnel's Android devices. It utilized the Tor network for communication, making it harder to track, and had the capability to scan local networks, potentially searching for other devices to infect.
So it's more stealthy and aggressive than previous versions. What about other Russian groups? Are they using similar tactics?
There are definitely signs of that. Turla, linked to the FSB, created a fake app pretending to target Russian websites. It likely aimed to infiltrate pro-Ukrainian hacktivist groups by appealing to their desire to disrupt Russian online services.
So using their target's own motivations against them, it makes you wonder if any platform is truly safe. What about secure messaging apps like Signal?
Unfortunately, no platform is entirely immune. A group tracked as UAC-02 was observed exploiting Signal to deliver malware disguised as military platforms. They use social engineering tactics to trick users into clicking malicious links sent through Signal messages.
So even with end-to-end encryption, the human element can still be a weak point. It seems like these groups are getting incredibly creative with their
They
methods.
are. And as we move on to iOS, the operating system for iPhones, we'll see how they've adapted their techniques to target what's generally considered a more secure platform.
All right, let's dive into the world of iOS malware. This should be interesting.
It is. We'll see familiar names like Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear making appearances, but their approaches to iOS are quite distinct from their Android campaigns.
I'm all ears. What kind of tactics are we talking about here?
Well, one example involves Fancy Bear and an iOS version of their X-Agent spyware. Researchers discovered this malware could steal various types of data from iPhones, including text messages, contacts, photos, and even recordings.
So essentially everything you wouldn't want someone else to see. But didn't we say earlier that iOS is generally considered more secure? How did they pull this off?
There was a catch. The iOS version of X-Agent required the target's device to be jailbroken. This process removes Apple's security restrictions, making it easier to install unauthorized software.
That makes sense. But how would Fancy Bear get someone to jailbreak their iPhone in the first place? Most people wouldn't even know how, let alone risk compromising their device.
That's the big question. Researchers speculate they might have used social engineering techniques or targeted individuals already known to have jailbroken devices, highlighting a more targeted approach compared to some of their Android campaigns.
So more selective targeting, but potentially with even greater access to sensitive information. Are there any other iOS cases that demonstrate this targeted approach?
Absolutely. In 2021, Cozy Bear was caught using LinkedIn messages to deliver zero-day exploits targeting Western European government officials.
LinkedIn. That's a bold move using a professional networking site for espionage. How did that work?
They sent messages containing malicious links. If the target clicked the link while using an iPhone, a previously unknown vulnerability in Apple's WebKit browser engine, the core of Safari would be triggered.
A zero-day exploit. That means Apple didn't even know about the vulnerability until it was too late? These exploits are incredibly valuable because they give attackers a significant advantage. What were they able to achieve with this exploit?
It allowed them to bypass Safari's security and inject malicious code into the victim's iPhone. The payload included a sophisticated piece of malware designed to steal authentication cookies from various websites, including major platforms like Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Yahoo.
So they're not just spying on the phone itself, but potentially gaining access to all sorts of online accounts. That's a serious escalation.
It is. With these stolen cookies, Cozy Bear could potentially impersonate their victims, accessing their emails, social media accounts, and even sensitive work-related data.
That's incredibly worrying. It seems like even the most secure platforms have vulnerabilities. Are there any other notable iOS attacks we should be aware of?
There's a case involving Pegasus, the infamous spyware developed by the Israeli firm NSO Group. While not directly attributed to a Russian group, the targeting of 7 journalists and activists with Pegasus raises some interesting questions.
Pegasus, that rings a bell. It's essentially spyware for hire, right? Governments and other organizations can buy it to track and monitor individuals.
That's the general idea, although NSO Group claims they only sell it to legitimate government agencies for law enforcement and national security purposes. However, there have been numerous reports of Pegasus being used to target journalists, activists, and political dissidents.
So how does this tie back to Russia?
In this specific case, the victims were all Russian-speaking or Belarusian-speaking individuals living in Europe, many of whom had been critical of the Russian government. The exact client who deployed Pegasus is unknown, but some experts believe a third-party actor was likely involved to obscure attribution.
So potentially a way for the Russian government to use Pegasus without directly linking themselves to the attacks.
Exactly. It's a tactic we see often in cyber espionage, where governments try to maintain plausible deniability.
It's a complex web trying to unravel who's behind these attacks. Are there any other iOS attacks where Russian involvement is suspected?
In 2024, Google uncovered a watering hole attack targeting Mongolian government websites. They compromised these sites, injecting malicious code that infected visitors' devices.
Clever. So instead of going after individuals directly, they set a trap. What happened when someone visited these compromised websites?
They were rigged to deliver exploits for both iOS and Android devices. The interesting thing is the exploits used were for known vulnerabilities, meaning that Apple and Google had already released patches to fix them.
So if the victims had kept their devices up to date, they would have been protected.
Most likely, yes. This underscores the importance of installing security updates promptly. In this case, the iOS exploit targeted a WebKit vulnerability, installing the same cookie-stealing malware Cozy Bear had used previously.
Again, we see the focus on gaining access to online accounts and potentially impersonating victims. It seems these groups are becoming increasingly brazen.
They are. And it's not just individual devices they're going after. Russian groups have also demonstrated the ability to disrupt and potentially spy on entire mobile networks with some alarming consequences.
Attacking an entire mobile network, that sounds like something out of a movie.
It is a different level of sophistication and impact, and those stories are exactly where we're headed next.
All right. Attacking an entire mobile network, that sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller. Where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, one group that's been particularly active in this area is Hidden Art, linked to the Russian government and operating since at least 2018. They've been targeting mobile networks globally, aiming to track individuals and intercept communications.
Hidden art. So not just going after individuals anymore, but aiming for the entire network. What kind of methods do they use to achieve this?
What's fascinating here is they exploit vulnerabilities in something called Signaling System 7, or SS7. It's essentially the backbone of global mobile communication, a set of protocols used by telecom companies to route phone calls and text messages.
So if they can tap into this SS7 system, they can essentially eavesdrop on conversations and track people's locations on a massive scale.
Exactly. And they've gotten pretty good at covering their tracks. One of their tactics involves disguising their origin by routing attacks through mobile network nodes located in Africa.
So it looks like the attack is coming from Africa, but it's actually originating from Russia. That's devious and incredibly difficult to trace.
It is. This technique makes attribution much harder, adding another layer of complexity to investigations. Hidden Art has been at this for a while, but there's another attack that stands out as particularly devastating, the Kyivstar wipeout attack from December 2023.
Kyivstar, that rings a bell. Wasn't that a major incident involving Ukraine's largest mobile operator?
Yes, it left millions of subscribers without voice and data services for 2 days. Investigations by the Ukrainian security services attributed the attack to Sandworm, the GRU-linked group we discussed earlier.
2 days without service, that's a significant disruption. What did Sandworm actually do to cause such a widespread outage?
Apparently, they had been trying to infiltrate Kyivstar's network for months. Once they gained access, they launched a destructive attack, wiping out data from thousands of virtual servers and workstations.
So essentially a digital scorched earth policy. What would be the motivation behind such an attack? Was it just about disruption?
It likely had multiple objectives. First, disrupting communication and sowing chaos during a critical period in the war. Remember, this was just months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Right, cripple the communication infrastructure to create confusion and hinder their efforts. But you said there might be other objectives.
Yes. The level of access Sandworm achieved could have also allowed them to steal personal data, track phone locations, and even intercept text messages.
So not just disruption, but potential espionage on a massive scale. What were the consequences of this attack, apart from the obvious disruption to Kyivstar's customers?
The financial impact was substantial. It reportedly cost Kyivstar's parent company Vion nearly $100 million in damages. There was also significant reputational damage, eroding trust in Kyivstar's security measures.
A stark reminder of the real-world consequences of these attacks. It's not just theoretical, it's impacting people's lives and critical infrastructure.
Exactly. The Kyivstar attack shows how cyber warfare can spill over into the physical world, causing real harm and disruption. And as we've seen, Russian groups are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their tactics, targeting individuals and entire networks.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from Android and iOS malware to attacks on mobile networks. What are some key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
The first takeaway is that this threat is real, and it's constantly evolving. Russian groups are highly motivated, well-resourced, and persistent in their pursuit of information and disruption. The second is that everyone is a potential target. It's not just governments or high-profile individuals. Ordinary citizens can become victims either through targeted campaigns or as collateral damage in broader operations.
So it's not a matter of if you'll be targeted, but when. That's a sobering thought. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There must be things we can do to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. There are steps you can take to mitigate these risks, and knowledge is power. Understanding the methods used by these groups can help us be more vigilant.
Okay, good. Let's shift gears and talk about defense. What can our listener do to protect themselves from these increasingly sophisticated threats?
Okay, good. Let's shift gears and talk about defense. What can our listener do to protect themselves from these increasingly sophisticated threats? Well, the first and most basic step is to keep your devices updated. Make sure you install the latest security patches from Apple and Google. Remember that Mongolian watering hole attack we talked about? Many of those exploits targeted vulnerabilities that had already been patched.
Right. Those update notifications can be annoying, but they're there for a reason. We need to stop ignoring them. What else can we do?
Be conscious about what you click on and what you download. Don't open links or attachments from unknown senders, and only download apps from official app stores like Google Play and Apple's App Store.
So common sense cybersecurity hygiene applies here too. It's all about being aware and thinking twice before clicking on something that looks suspicious.
Exactly. And of course, strong passwords and two-factor authentication are still crucial. They can significantly reduce the risk of account compromise.
Those are good reminders for everyone, not just those worried about targeted attacks. What about phishing attempts? We hear a lot about those. Any advice on how to spot and avoid them?
Yeah, phishing is a constant threat. Always double-check the sender's address and be wary of any requests for personal information. Remember, legitimate organizations rarely ask for sensitive data through email or text messages.
Good point. So be skeptical and verify before giving away any personal information. What about using a VPN? Would that provide any protection against these types of attacks?
A VPN can definitely add an extra layer of security, especially when you're using public Wi-Fi. It encrypts your internet traffic, making it more difficult for attackers to intercept your data.
That makes sense. So a good idea for anyone concerned about online privacy and security in general, not just those specifically worried about Russian mobile threats.
Absolutely. But beyond individual steps, I think it's also important to highlight that staying informed is crucial. Keep up with the latest news and developments, in cybersecurity organizations like CISA and NIST provide excellent resources and guidance.
So knowledge is power in this case. The more we understand about the threats, the better equipped we'll be to protect ourselves.
Precisely. And if you have any specific concerns or need help implementing security measures, don't hesitate to seek advice from cybersecurity professionals.
Great advice. This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. We've uncovered the tactics, the targets, and the motivations behind Russian mobile threats. It's clear these are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader, calculated strategy.
Right, and they're using these capabilities to advance geopolitical interests, gather intelligence, and disrupt their adversaries. What's particularly concerning is this blurring of lines between state-sponsored actors and cybercriminal tools.
You mentioned that earlier with the UACA02 DIN group and their use of the Hydra malware, which is typically associated with cybercrime.
Yeah, it's a trend we're seeing more and more. It raises important questions about attribution and motivation. Are we witnessing a deliberate strategy by the Russian government to leverage cybercriminal capabilities? Or is it more opportunistic, simply taking advantage of readily available tools?
Tough question. It's difficult to say for sure, but regardless, the implications are significant. It means the threat landscape is becoming more complex and harder to defend against.
Absolutely. It underscores the need for a comprehensive approach to cybersecurity, one that involves governments, businesses, and individuals working together.
So it's not just about individual actions like installing antivirus software or being careful about what links we click. It requires a broader societal shift toward greater awareness and resilience.
Exactly. We need to prioritize cybersecurity education, invest in research and development, and strengthen international cooperation to counter these evolving threats effectively. This isn't just a tech issue, it's a global challenge that requires a united front.
That's a powerful message. We can't afford to be complacent in this digital age. We need to be proactive and work together to protect ourselves in our digital world. So before we wrap up, what's the most important message our listeners should take away from this deep dive?
Stay informed, stay vigilant, and don't underestimate the threat. Russian mobile threats are real. They're evolving, and they have the potential to impact all of us.
Well said. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it can also be our shield. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Russian mobile threats. We hope you found it informative and empowering.
It was my pleasure. Stay safe out there.